Honored today to have with us Lindsay Benstead, who is a professor of politics and global studies in the Hatfield School of Government and director of the Middle East Studies Center here at Portland State. She served as a fellow in the Middle East program and the Women's Global Leadership Initiative at the Wilson International Center for Scholars in DC, and has been a Kuwait visiting professor at Sciences Po in Paris. Her research on women in politics, public opinion, and survey methodology has appeared in numerous publications. She served as a doctoral fellow at Yale University and a postdoctoral fellow at Princeton, and she is here today to help guide us through a very complex thicket. So big hand for Lindsay.
Great. Thank you, Tim, for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be here. The title of my presentation today is Why Do Some Arab Citizens Support Arab-Israeli and Israeli-Palestinian Peace? Evidence for an inside-out effect. Or excuse me, an outside-in effect. Signed in 2020 by Israel and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, the Abraham Accords are the most significant regional peacemaking achievement in decades, having already reduced Arab-Israeli tensions and, even before October 7th, provided some opportunities for Arab states to mediate between Israel and the Palestinians. The Accords, unfortunately, may also have played a role in Iran's support for and Hamas's decision to attack Israel on October 7th, due to the possibility that Saudi Arabia may soon join the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords remain relevant today, and they are a pillar of U.S. policy in the region, having been supported in speeches by Blinken in recent years.
We're having a little trouble with the way the slides are translating to the, there we go. Take it this way, right there.
Okay, thank you. The Abraham Accords are also part of a new regional security architecture that, in addition to Israel, Bahrain, and the UAE, also includes closer ties between Egypt, Jordan, and Iraq. All of these actors see a common threat in Iran and global jihadi groups such as ISIS and Hamas. In Israel's search for security, the Abraham Accords represented an outside-in approach. Whereas the Oslo Peace Accords focused on peace with the Palestinians, the Abraham Accords represent an attempt by Israel to first normalize relations with its Arab neighbors before making new attempts to achieve peace with the Palestinians. In this moment of crisis, with the suffering of civilians in Gaza and the suffering of hostages as well, in Israeli hostages in Gaza, we're certainly at a moment of crisis, which encourages us to think about how U.S. foreign policy can support Arab-Israeli and Israeli-Palestinian peace. I want to present some findings from a research paper that's about to be finished, which draws on the Arab Barometer to examine public opinion in the Arab world towards Arab-Israeli and Palestinian-Israeli peace. In the paper, I address two questions. The first is, whether and why do some ordinary Arab citizens support Arab-Israeli and Israeli-Palestinian peace? And do these bilateral peace agreements, such as the Abraham Accords, increase support for conciliatory solutions to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Are these merely a cold peace? Do these agreements merely matter between governments, or do they also have an impact on the attitudes of ordinary citizens? The peace process refers to the U.S. role in peacemaking efforts in the Middle East following the 1948 independence of Israel and the 1948 Nakba for the Palestinians, which was followed by the 1948 to 1949 Israeli War of Independence, or the First Arab-Israeli War. The first agreement in the peace process occurred in Egypt in 1979, when, after Israel captured 5 territories in the 1967 war, and after a decade of failed peacemaking, under the leadership of President Carter, Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, and Egyptian President Anwar Sadat agreed to a peace treaty. This peace treaty saw the return of the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt in exchange for Egyptian assurances that it would no longer attack Israel. It wasn't until 50 years after the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 that the Israelis and the Palestinians mutually recognized one another. Prior to the 1990s, it was against Israeli law for an Israeli to speak to a member of the PLO. The Oslo Peace Accords were something that initially, of course, it was hoped would bring a final status agreement, a two-state solution between the Israelis and the Palestinians. There were a few commitments that Israel and the Palestinian Authority made during the within the Oslo Accords. Israel committed to recognizing the PLO, which would now be called the Palestinian Authority, and it would transfer lands to PA control, the amounts to be determined by interim agreements. So you can see a map of the West Bank. Here we can see the dark areas are areas A, which Israel pulled out of and turned over to administrative control by the Palestinian Authority. These are places like Bethlehem, Ramallah, and Jericho. Israel also committed to creating a PA police force and arming that police force. The Palestinian Authority agreed to end terrorism by the PLO, to recognize Israel's right to exist, and to amend its charter, which had called for the destruction of Israel, and to educate for peace. Critically, the Oslo Peace Accords were supposed to result within 5 years, by 1999, in a final status agreement. In other words, in a two-state solution, following negotiations which would cover issues such as the right of return, Jerusalem, Palestinian statehood, and settlements. And of course, we know that we're several decades on from the Oslo Peace Accords, and many people see the Oslo Peace Accords as unable, or as really as a framework that can't lead to a two-state solution any longer. Jordan then also signed a peace treaty with Israel in 1999. It was some years until 2020 when the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Israel saw common interests and decided to normalize relations. Mauritania and North Sudan, North Sudan, are among the 7 Arab countries that now have diplomatic relationships with Israel. So as I mentioned, Secretary Blinken has made some speeches in which he has supported the widening of the Abraham Accords as a way to promote peace in the region. So in that sense, we could call the Abraham Accords American policy. So one could ask, is there, this is sort of the outside-in approach to peacemaking from the point of view of the Israelis. Can we also see an impact of these agreements on the attitudes of ordinary citizens? For example, if citizens live in countries with bilateral peace agreements with Israel, will they be more likely to support the Abraham Accords? And crucially, will they be more likely to support one of the forms that a peace agreement could take between the Israelis and the Palestinians? And I'll talk about 3 potential solutions to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that are identified in the Arab Barometer by the Arab scholars that wrote the questionnaire. So they suggested 3 in particular: the two-state solution based on the pre-1967 borders. So that's historically been US policy and the most commonly understood solution to the conflict. Another solution could be one state for all of its citizens, Arabs and Jews. And a third possibility could be an Israeli-Palestinian confederation. So maybe something in between option 1 and option 2. Okay, so the first point of US policy is the idea that we should support the Abraham Accords and widening those accords to include Saudi Arabia if that becomes possible. And the second point of U.S. policy that I want to also identify is one that is included within our development policy. USAID, for instance, in a lot of its efforts to develop democratic governance in different places, not only in the Arab world, but in other regions as well. One of the vehicles that we use to do that is to support civil society organizations. So to find organizations on the ground and to give them support and help them do the work that we would think of as building social capital. So thinking of Robert Putnam's theory, he theorized about how civil society organizations could lead citizens to develop social capital, interpersonal trust, and tolerance. And these orientations are critically important not only to having a strong democracy and an economy, but also they're necessary for peacemaking, especially really difficult conflicts, in very difficult conflicts like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So in the paper, I have several hypotheses that I'm going to test, but I'm going to talk about those 2 points today in my talk. The data that I use are from the Arab Barometer, the 7th wave, which was conducted in 2021 and 2022. Over 26,000 citizens in 12 countries responded to this survey, which was, as I said, conducted by the Arab Barometer team based at the University of Michigan and Princeton, but also working in collaboration with scholars in a number of Arab countries, which include Algeria, Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Lebanon, Libya, Mauritania, Morocco, Palestine, Sudan, and Tunisia. Okay, so I have 2 dependent variables that I would like to talk about. The first is what we would call support for the Abraham Accords. So this is the question that the scholars wrote and the answers that they got, pooled in all 12 countries. To what extent do you favor or oppose the normalization of relations between Arab states and Israel? So you could strongly favor to strongly oppose. And the takeaway point here is that there is a high level of opposition in these 12 countries to the Abraham Accords. We can see that only 13% say that they favor or they strongly favor the Accords. So there's a lot of work that would need to be done there. The large majority of respondents oppose the Abraham Accords in the Arab world. However, when we look at support for the Abraham Accords in each country individually, and we segment, so we see the 13% average regionally, but we segment those that do have a bilateral relationship with Israel and those that don't, we can see that there is a higher average support for the Abraham Accords in those countries where there is an agreement, with the highest support being 41% of the Sudanese, supporting the Abraham Accords, followed by Morocco at 35%. Then it drops down to 8% in Egypt, 6% in Mauritania, and 5% in Jordan. So these sort of the countries that have longstanding agreements, such as Jordan and Egypt, we still see a very low support for the Abraham Accords. We're really seeing this support being driven by 2 cases, Sudan and Morocco. On the no agreement side, Lebanon is the highest. So 19% of people in Lebanon support the Abraham Accords. The second dependent variable is preferred solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So these are the 4 solutions that I talked about earlier. Which solution from among the following do you prefer to put an end to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict? Here we can see that the traditional solution that has been preferred traditionally by Palestinians and Israelis, 58% of Arab citizens across the region say they prefer a 2-state solution based on the pre-1967 borders. On the other side of the spectrum, 17% said other, which also, as I looked into the data and what other variables this correlates with, other could be things like the destruction of Israel, not having an Israeli state. We also have in the middle 14% who say, and this can mean different things for different people, 1 state for Arabs and Jews. So 1 state for all of its citizens. That's 14%. And then 12% prefer a Palestinian-Israeli confederation. Okay, so we see a lot of support for the two-state solution. We see about 25% of the sample maybe calling on one of these non-traditional solutions that we could think of as even more conciliatory between the two groups, and then about 17% rejecting all of these potential solutions. And when we look at Palestinians specifically, and this is Khalil Shakaki, his survey organization in Ramallah that conducts this, and they conduct the research in Gaza and also in the West Bank. You can see that among Palestinians, this is before October 7th, so it may have changed, it may not have changed. We see similar proportions among Palestinians as well. 58% of Palestinians preferring a two-state solution, 14% one of the two, one state for all of its citizens or confederation, and then 28% rejecting one of these peace possibilities. Okay, so I run some multinomial logistic regressions and logistic regressions, and I include two key variables that I'll talk about here. One is whether the citizen is living in a country that already has a bilateral relationship with Israel. The second is whether that citizen is a member of a type of association. This could be a sports club, a mosque, a church, a women's organization. It includes a lot of different things, political organization. I include religious identity and a number of other controls that I talk about in the paper. And I'll just highlight briefly three findings. The first finding is that there is indeed evidence for an outside-in approach to peacemaking. Citizens living in a country that has an existing treaty with Israel are more likely on average to support not only Israeli-Palestinian peace, but also the Abraham Accords. So for example, respondents living in a country that has an agreement with Israel are 9% more likely to say that they would prefer a single state for Arabs and Jews than a two-state solution, and 7% more likely to say that they would prefer a confederation than a two-state solution. And they're also 20% more likely to simply say that they agree with the Abraham Accords. So in this early stage, we can see some evidence that this could be the case. We also find evidence for social capital theory operating in the Arab world. Those citizens who are a member of a civil society organization are also more likely to say that they support the Abraham Accords, and also more likely to say that they support one of the potential peace agreements that could be reached between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And finally, as in previous research that I've done on this subject, there are differences across the religious identities within the Arab world, with Christian citizens being the most supportive of the Abraham Accords and of Israeli-Palestinian peace, more so than the Sunni, and the Sunni being more supportive than the Shia. So religious identity is important. So in conclusion, religious identity shapes how citizens see the possibilities for different types of peace with Israel. But we also know that to the extent that the United States and other international donors support civil society, this can create conditions which are helpful for peacemaking. And then we also find evidence for the outside-in approach. Having a bilateral peace treaty with Israel is related to a higher likelihood of supporting the Abraham Accords. And two of the solutions to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in particular being the two, what I think of those as the most conciliatory approaches, the idea that maybe a two-state solution is no longer the best solution. But maybe there can be one state that is inclusive of all of its citizens, or that there would be a Palestinian and Israeli state, but they would be in some kind of a confederation, which would address the reality that a Palestinian state may not be contiguous, for instance. So to return to the final framing for today's session, the United States and the Middle East are at a crossroads. Can the U.S. continue to defend its interests in the Middle East and globally with a lower level of military and political involvement? I would suggest that the U.S. should recommit to a leading role in the region, and it should do so by focusing on peacemaking, including the Abraham Accords, as well as broader efforts at promoting political development through the supporting of local civil society organizations. Thank you.
Thanks, Lindsay. So I have a mic, Derek has a mic. How many of you have questions? If you raise your hands, I will come around and I will hand you a mic.
When you say Palestine, I presume you mean both West Bank and Gaza?
Yes, the Palestinian territories, West Bank and Gaza.
When I read that there's about 5 million there and about 9 million elsewhere, and I imagine most of those are in other Middle East Arab countries. I wonder how the Arab citizens in those countries and the Palestinians living and working there, do they see things like a two-state solution about the same?
So in other words, countries where there are many Palestinian refugees compared with those where there are not. I haven't included a variable for that. That would be, Jordan, of course, and Lebanon being the two countries that have the largest number. Jordan being the Arab country that has the largest number of citizens from a Palestinian background. It's possibly over 50% of Jordanian citizens that are Palestinian by heritage. And there was a pretty low support in Jordan for the Abraham Accords. Lebanon, of course, also has a large number of Palestinian refugees and its own domestic competition between the Sunni and the Shia and the Christians. It's higher, 19%. That could be driven by the large proportion of Christians who live in Lebanon, which was an important variable in the regression. So that's something to look into, whether if we just simply code for the proportion of Palestinian refugees that live in the country, if that would be a significant variable. Although, as I mentioned, there aren't very many countries in the Arab region where there are a high number of Palestinian citizens or refugees other than the few that I've mentioned. Thank you for the question.
I'll wait. Thank you.
Two questions very quickly. One, can you speak to identifying civil society organizations in the Middle East that are, I'll speak like a Republican now, that are the right religion? First question. Second is using the Abraham Accords as a metric, a useful metric in that you call it outside in, but essentially it formalized relationships between Bahrain and the Emirates with Israel, and then both of whom are strong U.S. allies in the region, along with Israel. And we bought off Sudan with a terrorist, taking them off the list. So I'm just wondering if that's really something that, as a metric, is helpful to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you for those questions. I'll say something first about civil society organizations. One thing that's important to point out is that when we look at the sample, the 26,000 respondents to the survey, only 5% say that they belong to a civil society organization. So that struck me as being very low. If you compare it to, for instance, US society, most people would say that they belong, I would think, maybe not most, but the majority of people would say that they belong to some kind of sports organization or women's or religious group, club. In this particular wave of the survey, they didn't distinguish between in some waves of the air barometer, they allow you to choose, is it a religious organization? Is it, different types? So I can't necessarily speak to, how each particular type of CSO relates to attitudes towards peacemaking. But I think the theory would be that, any kind of civil society organization can produce social capital, with the caveat that there's also this sort of literature on the dark side of social capital. So you can kind of imagine a gang or a white supremacist group having a lot of social capital, really trusting what we call bonding capital, really trusting people within their group, but not trusting or tolerating others. So they're sort of, it's not the case that every kind of organization is leading to the kind of social capital that we would think of as being helpful for democracy. But in general, the data suggest that all of these different types contribute. And your second question raises invites us to take off the rose-colored glasses, and it invites us to step away from this notion that, isn't it wonderful? We have the Abraham Accords. We have Jared Kushner, who went to the region, had personal relationships with leaders in Israel and Saudi Arabia and other countries, and was able to create an agreement between Israel and the UAE, which, it used to be that if you flew to Tel Aviv, that was the last stop. There was nowhere else that you would fly from there. But today you can fly to Dubai from Tel Aviv, and Jewish people, Israeli people go to Dubai. They celebrate Passover in Dubai. And it was notable that after October 7th, UAE was the country that made the statement that Israel has the right to defend itself. And that, I think, was pretty significant. But yes, we want to remove these rose-colored glasses because we also recognize that the Arab countries concerned are not democratic, and they are states that are repressing their own people. And so what did each of the states receive in exchange for agreeing to the Abraham Accords? In the case of Morocco, it was weapons from the United States and security cooperation with the Israelis. It was also an agreement by Israel and the United States to recognize Moroccan sovereignty over the Western Sahara, the Moroccan Sahara. So there was an exchange of interests. Spyware and technology that has been created in Israel as part of their anti-terrorism efforts has also been used by their partners, which include both those that have joined the Abraham Accords and others. And so when policymakers in the United States will consider perhaps allowing Saudi Arabia to join the Abraham Accords or encouraging it to join the Abraham Accords, we know that Saudi Arabia is asking for security guarantees from the United States. And so that's something that our policymakers will need to consider, given that Saudi Arabia represses dissidents and has murdered dissidents and things like that.
Yes, I know this is a little bit outside the scope of your presentation, but what do you think the ultimate geopolitical and domestic agendas of Iran are in this whole Middle Eastern thing, both through their proxies and, as an independent actor? Because it seems the Abraham Accords have a not so subtle subtext of being an anti-Iranian coalition and are looking to make a Middle East that gives a lot of countries protection from Iran. So what do you think Iran is attempting to do, and what can be done about it?
Thank you. We can have a debate about explaining Iran's foreign policy, whether it's a realist foreign policy or there's more of maybe within a constructivist theory having to do with religious ideas. So on the one hand, within a realist theory, one sort of subset of that is regime security. So the notion that states will make foreign policies that they believe for the incumbents within those states will make foreign policies that they believe will allow them to hold on to power. And so there are lots of ways I think that we can see that Iran sees sort of funding groups like Hamas, like Hezbollah, as supporting its regime security. A constructivist view might say, well, there is something to a religious idea, this notion that Iran, that in 12er Shiism, that there is a final Mahdi that comes back, and in order to have this messianic figure come back, that you have to kill Jews. You know, there are these really these theological beliefs that, whether people believe them or not, that are supported by the Iranian regime. Does that drive their foreign policy? You know, or is it sort of both together? But definitely regime security is a good way to explain why incumbents do what they do. How the US should respond, I mean, we have our own debates about this. I wouldn't think that supporting Iran would be in US national interest. That's my view.
Thank you. We're going to go to questions from the web that Tim is going to moderate. But I just want to note that is the good question on Iran. For those of you who joined us back in December when we Ahmadinejad speak, we dove into some of those questions at the Alberta Rose. So Tim, from the web.
We've got a couple different things related to the Abraham Accords. Are there efforts to encourage Israeli support for the Abraham Accords, and is there any research on that?
There are polls that are conducted, of course, in Israel. I don't analyze them, and I'm not sure what the answer to that question is.
Okay. And then the other one is, what role would Hamas play as Abraham Accords were to evolve?
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, I first traveled to Israel and Palestine in 2012, and then later on in 2016. So not a long time, just about over 10 years. And one thing that I've observed is that the geopolitical changes that are occurring play a role in what is possible. It's true that we have domestic politics in Israel where you know, you have the right and the left and who's in government. You have domestic politics in the Palestinian society where you have those that want a two-state solution. You have those like Hamas who reject a two-state solution. And so those domestic politics are very important. But geopolitics matters as well. And of course, we've just heard this morning, the ICJ has made a preliminary ruling calling on Israel to not commit genocide in Gaza. And so, you know, more and more, the world, I believe, sees that we have to have a solution to this problem. And the Arab neighbors believe that too. Saudi Arabia believes that. Jordan believes that. The King of Jordan believes that. And so having a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is something that requires international cooperation. The final status issues are so complex that without international partners putting money on the table, it will be very, very difficult to have a peace agreement. So just as an example, the right of return is the demand by Palestinians to return to their homes in Israel if they lost those homes in 1948. Well, perhaps that's something, we know that's something that Israel doesn't accept. So what will international partners do what will they offer to Palestinians in order to be able to resettle perhaps some in Israel, some in Palestine, and perhaps other parts of the Western world or the Arab world? So as geopolitical changes occur, of which the Abraham Accords is one example, the possibilities for the possibilities do change, and the likelihood of one thing happening over another also changes.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. My question is about the possible downside of the Abraham Accord, especially in regard to the recent Hamas attack, especially when you consider that sometimes Hamas has been trying to like playing more or less the game and like normalize their the goal of achieving their the political objectives, and it seems that don't work, and then they've been ridiculized, and then it seems that the Abraham Accord have been a big role into that. So should you consider also the possible risk of radicalization of some political organization in the peacemaking of the Middle East? Thank you.
I mean, for Israel, Israel is in, I believe, an impossible situation in that Hamas does not recognize the right of the state of Israel to exist. And we see support, considerable support for Hamas as well in the West Bank. And what this indicates, perhaps more than support for a global jihadi agenda, is just weariness that people have. Of course, Israel isn't occupying the Gaza Strip any longer. They did blockade it, but they are occupying the West Bank. And so people have a weariness with that, and they see Hamas as an actor that that can perhaps help them end the occupation. I saw an interview with Khalil Shakaki a couple of days ago, and he's the polling specialist who conducted this poll in Palestine. And he talked about the fact that many people in the West Bank, they don't know or understand what Hamas did on October 7th. When they do understand, they're much less likely to support Hamas. But it's almost like our media universe. If you're on YouTube and you watch Al Jazeera and you watch Fox News and you watch the Christian Broadcasting Network, MSNBC, it's almost like it's possible to hear two different languages and two different accounts of what has happened. And that is also something that I don't know what the solution is to that, but the fact that we're living in a globalized world where there's information doesn't mean that we all see the same that we see the same reporting. And so we shouldn't assume that Palestinians are necessarily okay with the atrocities that Hamas committed on October 7th. And is continuing to commit because they still have hostages.
Yeah, your data are pretty depressing in terms of support for the Abraham Accords. And I can think of two possibilities. One is that that's a source of internal instability in the UAE and the Saudis because they've got a population that's very opposed to it, but for transactional reasons, they've gone ahead with it. Or alternatively, it's possible that people in those countries really just don't care that much about the Abraham Accords, and so it won't be a source of instability. Which do you think is more likely?
So there was data. That's a very good question. There were a set of 4 questions in this wave that asked people how much they followed news on the Abraham Accords, the Uyghurs, and 2 other, the civil war in Syria and 1 other issue. And the highest was the Abraham Accords, but the overall level of attention to these issues was low. At the same time, there is also a bit of a puzzle as well when we think about the region as a whole. Why is it that Algerians and Kuwaitis have the most hardline views in the region towards Israel, whereas other countries don't? And so I do think that individual circumstances in the Arab countries play a role. Algeria, of course, was brutally colonized by France for 130 years, and that is one reason why Algerians are very loath to support any kind of a peace agreement with Israel. But there are these puzzles, and I don't think as scholars we completely understand the answer to that question.
Can we revisit for a second your reference to UN Resolution 194, right of return, including that caveat?
Mhm.
Is really unsophisticated, but is there a distinction between Palestinian citizens and Palestinian refugees? The refugees camps were established for Palestinians who who adhered to right of return. And
Mhm.
so are you possibly suggesting that 194 is on the table to revisit in terms of an adaptive foreign policy, and by who?
Mhm. Okay, thank you. The Oslo Accords envisioned this 5-year negotiating period where Israel would slowly withdraw from areas within the West Bank, and the PA would cease terrorism. And the idea was that there would be these final status issues that would have to be negotiated in order to have a two-state solution. So from an Israeli point of view, they would say, we committed to resolving whatever issues we have with the Palestinians within this framework. And one of the issues is the right of return. I wish I had a photo of this so that there's a Palestinian and an Israeli view on the right of return. I took some photos in Palestine, in both Bethlehem and Jericho, where you see keys. So, for instance, there's a roundabout entering Jericho where there's a big key, and it says right of return. It's our right to return. And so the notion is that now there are millions of people who or their grandparents were displaced. They lived in what is now Israel when the war broke out in 1948, and they were expulsed or they ran away due to fear. They thought they would be able to come back, but they were not allowed to come back. And so from a Palestinian point of view, the idea would be, if I have the key to a home, or symbolically a key, if I am a registered refugee, so that's passed down generationally, then I have the right to return. An Israeli point of view would be that in 1948, approximately 750,000 Palestinians lost their homes in Israel, and approximately 750,000 Jews left the Arab world to come to Israel, and that there is no right of return. There can be a Palestinian state, but Israel did not force, for about over 30% of Israeli society is Arab Israeli. So citizens of Israel and permanent residents in East Jerusalem, that's a more thorny issue. And so from the Israeli point of view, they would say, no, there isn't a right of return. This is a Jewish state, and then there can be a Palestinian state, and that's for Palestinians.
Okay, we're coming down on our time here. Do we have, because I was going to ask one more question. Tag, go ahead.
Okay. Thanks, Lindsay. Very interesting presentation. I was taking some notes, but I think I have too many points, so I'm going to try to nail it down to what I think are the important points. Am I the only Arab or Palestinian in the room? So the first point I would raise is the 1948, you called it, and everybody calls it, the War of Independence. So my first question is, independence from whom? Another thing is, we talk about several timelines, time points where there were attempts to have peace between Israel and Palestine, and the impression is that they all failed because the Palestinians rejected them. What I would say is probably what you know, is that the Palestinians had made many, many, many concessions that Israel refused over and over. You didn't mention the settlements, which are a violation of the United Nations, as well as the US government. Until this day, Israel is not abiding by cessation of the further and more construction of settlements. The Abraham Accord was like apparently the last attempt as what we could call a peace agreement. And when we look at the 3 states that that worked on that, we'll see that they are Bahrain and United Arab Emirates, which are geographically very far, politically not necessarily relevant, et cetera, et cetera. So why would 2 states from the Arab world go ahead and do an agreement with Israel that should be acceptable to the rest of the world?
Tag, in the interest of time, can you move it into a question?
Yes, okay, yeah,
please?
thank
Thanks.
you. So this is very interesting, but it doesn't talk about these very major points that unfortunately are always presented in a lopsided way that does not represent a lot of the facts on the ground. The Palestinians want to go back home, not necessarily to Israel. And I repeat that there were many concessions and many agreements that Israel refused to accept. So hopefully this will be just, you know, make people aware of these facts as well. And thanks again. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. It is very, very difficult, you know, to think about what a solution could be. And that's why going back to geopolitical conditions and thinking about, well, Saudi Arabia borders Israel. It's saying it wants to join the accords. It says it won't do that without a Palestinian state. You know, we may see some hope there of a resolution. But one thing is for sure that we should be all working for peace in whatever our sphere of influence is, and however we can be helpful to our neighbors, whether they be here near to us as well as far away in this region.
Okay, we are at time. Let's give a big hand to Lindsay Benstead. I want to invite Derek Olson to come up and say a few words, and then we will send you off into your day.
So thanks again for this wonderful presentation today, and we'll be looking forward to seeing you a week from today for the next Great Decisions Talk. In the email has all the details about the series. Also the what Jesse mentioned this morning about Bridge Together. We have flyers out there, but an email went out this morning, which you can digitally register, get tickets, and hope to join us. But it's great to see you all here. Thanks everybody for zooming in, and we'll see you a week from today. Sorry, no, not a week from today. We're switching, correct, Tim, to?
Yeah, we are bookending this series. We're starting on a Friday, we're ending on a Friday. Everything else is on a Wednesday, just to keep you on your toes.
Yes.
So after this week, we switch to Wednesdays. The 22nd, which is the last event, which became the last event because of, you know, the snowmageddon here. The Midwestern boy in me scoffs at all of you, but is the 22nd is a Friday. So
Yep.
Wednesdays from here on out until then.
Same room, check all the emails, same room next Wednesday for 6 in a row, and then the last one on a Friday. Thanks so much. Stay safe. Have a good weekend.